available. Harish and I will be switching off our videos and audios, but we will, anything you can like write to us on chat in case of time limitations or anything. Either Peter or I will be messaging you in the chat box.
Okay.
So we
great.
are there, but just audios and videos off. Yeah.
I feel like I'm being taken good care of. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody.
So Aisha is here and she's saying, hey, Stuart. So you have a...
Oh, yay. Nice to see Aisha.
Hey, Aisha.
Peter, basically you can look at the audience because more than 100 have registered. So depending on the numbers, you just start by 703 or 705, like you take it that way.
On average, I've been discovering that roughly, if you get 50% of people who have signed up to actually attend, you're doing well.
Yeah. That's been my experience as well with events I've put on.
Okay. It's I guess a lot of fatigue with most people doing so much online, not necessarily even fatigue, but just conflicting events. So you have other stuff to do.
Yeah. It's incredible how this whole pandemic has opened the world up to, here I am reading at a reading series hosted in India. I have Australia. It's England a few months ago, and I get to see writers from all over the world. It's I'm glad there's that incredible upside to all that we're going through. Yeah.
You're in Canada, right?
Yes.
And which part of
near Toronto.
All right.
About an hour from Toronto.
I have a cousin who lives in the Toronto region.
Oh, okay. Just flipping through my pages to see if there's a last minute little addition I'm gonna spring on you. The only reason I sent you that note was, I know you look at some of the work in advance, so. People are coming in. It's very exciting.
Yes. Aisha, of course, we've said hi to. I'm just looking for any other familiar names.
Yeah, somebody from Canada, Laurie, has also joined.
Yes, Laurie says, I'm happy to attend from Canada. Very happy to have you here, Laurie. We haven't had anyone from Australia yet, right? Have we? From the Anglophone countries, Australia?
No, not even in the festival.
Not UK either, right?
UK, we've got one poet. It's a long story. The day she landed, our former Chief Minister Jayalalitha passed away. So we have to kind of, I've sent a volunteer and I booked a room for the volunteer for her. She stayed there for 2-3 days. Then she left after the morning. So no readings, nothing, because the state was closed. So we had a poet from UK, but yeah, so that was that. And then there was this poet from US, Charles Steen. He came when there was 2015 floods. He came 2-3 days before we took him out on for tour. We put him in hotel, then just kind of lost. He got stuck. We got stuck for the next 5-6 days. When things turned better, I went to see him. He was not there in the hotel. I got scared, like what happened to him? Because the hotel ran out of diesels for generator. They shifted him to the other hotel. Then I have to go find him.
Wow.
So it was like, he wrote an article in Hindu about his experience getting stuck in the floods and going back to US.
Wow.
A lot of stories. But this is like the tops. And the next year he came, he got struck in the Varda, um, cyclone. And then towards the end, I think 15 and 16 was our biggest, like 15 completely got cancelled, but yeah, 16 at least we had till the cyclone, and then Jayalalitha passed away. So then like we just had like parts of the festival.
Wow.
She just came in. That was the first time we had somebody from UK.
Yeah.
So we have from France, Mediterranean. We had two poets, Giuseppe Conte and Sala Stette. We have from Spain. We have got poets from France because the collaborations work a lot with the French embassy. So
I
yeah,
see. That's great.
yeah, but yeah, we had poet from German also. There's this sound poet called Dirk. So he came.
Oh, sound poet. Very nice. I've done a lot of sound poetry. I won't be doing any this. I was going to say this morning, but for you tonight. But I've done a lot of sound poetry. That's great. You had a sound poet from Germany.
What's sound poetry?
I was about to do something. I realized there's an audience here. It's okay. Yeah. So sound poetry could just be like kind of thing. Just whatever kind of sounds, syllables, breaking down words. Could be chanting involved, or it could be more like free jazz, which was the kind I sort of do. Yeah, it's sometimes people are in like a whole choir of sound poets making weird noises, and
Right.
usually the audiences just laugh if they haven't ever seen it before.
Mhm.
And the poets know that, and it's a lot of, it can be a lot of fun.
All right.
So it's mix of a lot of different noises.
All right.
So, and also we did bring the curator of the Zebra Poetry Film Festival from Germany and showcase their films.
Wow.
All right.
Wow, that's great.
We're at 7:05 now. So
Yes, we can start.
all right. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us from wherever in the world you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of the day it is for you. I do know that many of you here are coming in probably to listen to Stuart specifically and from Canada, but our audiences are from all over. But let me, before we start go into the readings, let me quickly just tell those of you who are here for the first time. Prakriti Foundation is NGO, an arts and culture NGO based in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu in South India. And since 1998, they've been doing events, short, long-term festivals, awards, prizes, and everything all around the arts and culture, mainly in Chennai, but also with some of the festivals in other parts of India as well. Poetry with Prakriti is one of the festivals that the Prakriti Foundation does. Convention in the years gone by, what it has been is poets from all over India and a few from other parts of the world come into Chennai. Each of them spends varying periods of time, 4 or 5 days each, overlapping over a period of about a fortnight in December, at the time when the very famous worldwide Madras music season happens, where you have the very best Carnatic musicians from all over India coming in to play in Chennai. And it was, I remember Meera telling me at some point in time, to show that Chennai was a good cultural city, and not just for the music, but there was other things happening as well. The Poetry with Prakriti is particularly lovely to me because it takes poetry out of the usual kind of places. So you would be doing your readings in your bookshops and your art galleries and that kind of thing, where you're used to having, experiencing poetry. But also in, say, a shopping mall or a restaurant, in the metro train, uh, public places, and taking poetry out in different kinds of ways. And then you also get to meet and hang out with poets from other parts of the world uh, who you might not have encountered otherwise. And remember, this has been happening for many years before. India has had this explosion of literary festivals, with, of course, the Jaipur Literature Festival and a bunch of other things. This was from way before that all of this stuff started happening. We are more used now to, poets who normally don't get very much airing and, bringing out, they're getting to have a lot of other platforms. So Prakriti's been doing this for a very long time. Of course, 2020 happened, and it became unwise to have either public gatherings or to have people travel. And the foundation decided that it would not be safe last year to plan ahead for the festival in December. Instead, what they decided to do was take Poetry with Prakriti online. And with that also came the lack of limitations, the kind of limitations you would have had if the festival was only in Chennai, and where you can have poets coming in from other parts of the world without spending too much money beyond paying for a Zoom account, and experience this right through the year, rather than what would be useful for a planner, which is to have a bunch of stuff all together and coordinate that. So for the first 3 Saturdays of every month, starting at the end of October, there has been a different poet each Saturday, reading their work, chatting with the audience, interacting, answering questions, and initially planned to go up to the end of October this year. But a little bird tells me we might continue beyond that as well. So lots more poetry coming your way. That's it for, and of course, there'll be other things that happen as well. Open mics. We have done a memorial reading we have for Margaret Mascarenhas earlier in the year. We will have another one coming up shortly that remembers the work of Eunice D'Souza and other stuff as well. But for now, enough from me. Let me hand this over to Dr. Veena, who is going to introduce our poet for today.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. Thank you for a wonderful introduction about Chennai, especially. Thank you, sir. Before I start about the poet of the day, I would like to share a few words about my college. My college is Srimati Dev Dunva Nananda Vaishnav College for Women. Our college has been imparting quality education for more than half a century. And according to Education World, our college is one of the best colleges, one of the best 16 arts and science colleges in Tamil Nadu. The college has more than 6,500 students, and we have more than 30 streams, disciplines. And we cater to the need of the students, especially women students. And the important thing about our college is we have a digital library, which is considered to be a repository of a lot of resources, which will really help our students to come a long way. And yeah, this is about our college. On behalf of SDNP Vaishnav College, I'm very happy to welcome the poet of the day, Mr. Stuart Ross, Mr. Peter, Mrs. Meera and her team. They have to talk about Mrs. Meera and the team. It's like our journey with Prakriti is almost a decade more. So it is always a wonderful journey with Prakriti Foundation. A special appreciation to Professor Hema, Department of English. Without her, this Prakriti would not happen at SDNP Vaishnav College. I'll take time to share a few words about Stuart Ross. Mr. Stuart Ross is a Canadian writer, editor, writing teacher, and small press activist. He's the award-winning author of 20 books of poetry, fiction, and essays. His poetry titles include Motel of the Opposable Thumbs, which was published in 2019. A Sparrow Came Down Resplendent in the year 2016, and A Hamburger in the Gallery in 2015. In 2019, Mr. Stuart won the Harbourfront Festival Prize for his contributions to Canadian literature. He has also won the Mona Elaine Adilman Award for Jewish fiction and the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for poetry. His poetry has been translated into various other languages. He's currently working on 10 different books, which have been influenced by surrealism. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us virtually. It is indeed a great honor to have you with us, sir. Once again, on behalf of SDM Vaishnav College, we welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Beena.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, of course, for the association of your college with this. It would be lovely, of course, to be sitting in a, in your college and having this festival there, as we might have in other times, and hopefully in the future we will be able to do that. But for now, thank you for supporting this festival. And without further ado, Stuart Ross.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you so much, Dr. Beena. Thanks also to Mira and Harish and everyone involved in the Poetry with Prakriti team. It's a real honor to read. It was great to hear a little earlier about the whole history of the festival and all that the foundation does with theater and literature and dance. So it's very exciting to be here in my living room, reading to you. So I'm going to start off with a poem called Poem at 61. And my 62nd birthday is coming up in about 2 weeks, so I have to read this one very quickly before I'm no longer 61. It begins with an epigraph by the Irish novelist Flann O'Brien. There was a little silence. I can't decide which of my feet is best. I put neither forward. There are so many people floating around now. The clouds are teeming. Music saturates our bones. I open a letter. It indicates that I contain a skeleton. Put your ear to my rib cage and listen hard. Do you hear the voices of my family? Can you hear a radio in 1979? Dry leaves whirl around me. Snow covers my shoulders. It melts. Oh, regard the magnificent kingfishers alighting upon my brow. There is no reason to shudder. Absorb the soft hug of silence. Lift thy skeleton into the air. The wonders you observe will never bumble. Read a very short, untitled poem. I, a tree, change colors. Gray to black to charcoal. Outer space reaches down and yanks me into itself. This is a poem called Heron. And I always debate about whether to talk about where the poems come from. I think I won't in this case anyways. Heron. Give me just one more day, he says. I will eat a tiny piece of bread, maybe stare out the window. Yeah, I will lie in this unmade bed this one more day. It's not like I have big plans. I'll rub my chin, won't shave. Look how thin my fingers have become. Just one more day to think of her. The way she turned to look at that heron swooping over the water and then cram me into the earth. The way she turned and what she wore, the things she said. I don't remember the things she said. It is Thursday. He gazes at the ceiling, feels the mattress against his limbs. This is what it is like to feel the mattress against his limbs. He sees the crack in the ceiling he'd meant to patch. He sees a crow fly by his window. Here's a car horn below. Just Friday, he says. When I did my little thanks at the beginning, I should also add, I want to thank everyone who's coming here to listen to the poetry from all over the world. It seems like there's at least a few continents here. It's very, very exciting. This next poem, I'll tell you, my name is Ross, but the original family name was Rozowski. My paternal grandparents came from Russia. They came over to Canada around 1920. And so I could have been a writer named Rozowski, but I got stuck with the name that my family changed it to, which was Ross, which is a very, very boring name. And so I invented a character named Rozowski who would be in my poems. And I have a book, in fact, called Rozowski at Peace. And it was my way of getting the name Rozowski, my original family name, onto a book cover. So I've written about 20 or 30 poems about Rozowski, and this is one of the most recent ones. And it alludes to a very famous river in Russia called the Volga River. And this poem is called Rozowski on the Volga. And it's dedicated to a poetry comrade of mine, Gala Uzurtova. The sun bobs on the surface of the Volga River. It is pink. It is blue. It is gray. Rozowski sits at his piano on a rowboat 30 meters from the shore. The shore is speckled with seaweed. Fog crawls along the waters. His piano teacher, Peterson, looks like Tchaikovsky. Rozowski has a wind-up Tchaikovsky atop his piano. He hasn't practiced all week. He had toys to play with, cartoons to watch. His fingers stumble over the keys, Volga boatmen, but he's thinking of other things while he plays, like his guilt, his guilt, his guilt. For Peterson, his teacher, this is torture. A girl from a nearby village watches from beneath a larch. She sees this fisherman every summer. He is so old, his arms so thin. He pushes his oars through the fog, then drifts. She thinks she hears him singing, but it's only the dirge of a herring gull riddled with guilt. This is a little poem about a friend of mine, a great Canadian poet named Nelson Ball. He wrote very minimalist poems, mostly about nature. And in fact, this painting behind me is by his wife, the abstract painter, Barbara Crusoe. Barbara and Nelson are both gone now. And this is a poem that I wrote for him, after him, about being with him in his home in a little town in Ontario called Paris, Ontario. And he lived on a street called Willow Street. Nelson and I sit facing each other in silence. I get up, put a kettle on the 2-burner stove, sit back down, resume our silence. The kettle rattles. I pour myself a tea, sit back down, resume our silence. We cover a lot of ground. Nelson was a minimalist as a poet, and he was also a minimalist in conversation. There was a lot of silences with time spent with him. This poem is called Weekly. What made you do it? I was nearing the end of my life. What did you wear? Cake. Will you be punished? I will tear open my chest and insert the lights of Paris. Does music play a role? It is something I love but resist. How does truth play into it? I see a tree, I touch it. It is my father. He is expressionless. What advice would you have for the young? Don't fill it up to the top. Another very short untitled poem. When they fall, they cover the earth. Snowflakes, gas masks, meteors, hummingbirds, spools of thread, spider webs, regrets. And here's a bleak little poem called "And Thus Shall It Unfold." You and I, we will spread a yellow blanket across the green grass, and from our picnic basket, we'll lay out a variety of cheeses, soft and hard. And you remembered glasses, so we pour ourselves some wine, and we sit cross-legged, facing each other's faces. Look, you murmur, pointing to the sky, and there we see a magnificent canvas of birds flapping in unison, a giant arrow pointing south. But instead of grass, there will be pebbles, small and hard like tumors. Instead of cheeses, corroded batteries and spark plugs. Instead of birds, there will be the ashes of burning trees. Instead of wine, our sweat. Instead of faces, dead bees. Oh, here's a poem here that is actually refers to Nelson Ball, the poet with whom I talked about sitting and having a quiet tea with. This is called Poem Beginning with a Line by Nelson Ball. Hundreds of small black birds clustered around a dictionary. They sniffed at the binding, trailed their beaks along the crisp pages. A man approached, and the birds took wing, sailing up into the clouds. The man reached down and clutched the dictionary. He lifted it to his eyes, opened it to a random page. The letters on the page were birdseed. Just have a couple more poems to read for now. This is a poem about the great pleasures of attending an open mic reading, and open mic readings can be amazing. They can be wonderful. They can be great opportunities for young poets to present their work, or older poets to present their work for the first time, but they can also be torture, depending on who comes up to read. I wrote this poem during an open mic, and it was just an act of survival to write this poem during the open mic. It's called Everything. You listen to terrible poetry. I listen to terrible poetry. Rod Steiger listens to terrible poetry. A squashed caterpillar listens to terrible poetry. The town crier listens to terrible poetry. Emma Goldman listens to terrible poetry. The flaming sky listens to terrible poetry. I wrote a poem. I was lonely. I wrote a poem describing how I was lonely. Many a person said I should write a book. The next day, I wrote one. I called it Eschew My Feet. It was copyrighted. It made my muscles sore to write it. I went to sleep. I dreamed about everything. When I opened my eyes, everyone became very emotional all at once. And Just one more poem for now. This one is called The Road. The road is just a road. No matter how many hearses stumble drunk through its dirt and pebbles, no matter how many birds fall dead and raise dust, no matter how many buildings collapse on either side of it, the road is just a road. It did not ask to be a road. It was happy being nothing. Thanks very much.
On behalf of the people who cannot be seen and heard, thank you. Thank you for that reading. And yeah, you know, in the process of this, you did explain one thing, which is I wondered what your Twitter handle was about, and now I know.
Yes, Mr. Rozowski is my Twitter handle, my old family name.
Folks in the audience, we will be taking questions. If you have any, please remember to put them in the Q&A box. You're of course welcome to, I have pasted this in the wrong place. Let me paste it to the audience. Hang on. Yes. Yeah. I will invoke moderator privilege and decide what questions get asked. And also, hey, I get to start this off by asking questions. This is the perks of this, you know, volunteering with Prakriti Foundation. So Stuart, I'd like to just go back into you and poetry and your relationship with it. What were the first things that you remember as being poems? For most of us, it's nursery rhymes, of course, but is there anything specific that you remember as this is something, an entity called a poem?
Yeah, I have a really great memory of, I was probably just about 5 or 6 years old. And as you said, yeah, of course, there'd been nursery rhymes and things, but at that age, I wasn't thinking about poems. My father came home one day and he had this big box that had these 2 big reels on them, and it was a tape recorder, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and we'd never seen such a thing. It was incredible. And he put it on the living room floor and we all sat around it, and he showed us how you could record your voice and then you could rewind it, you could hear your voice, and it was to us this was an amazing thing. And my mother had, I think, like a big old anthology of poetry. And there was a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson called Charge of the Light Brigade, very famous poem. And she read that into the tape recorder and rewound it, and we listened to it again. And I think that was the first time that I realized poem, you know, just the rhythm, the relentless, forceful rhythm of that poem was just amazing to me. I didn't really understand what the poem was about, but the repetition and the rhythms, and maybe even just the way my mother read it with such care and such authority, I think this is something special, this poem. That's my first memory of poetry. And then, you know, I started reading more Dr. Seuss children's books and all of those sorts of things. And eventually, when I was 11 or 12, I began reading E.E. Cummings and the American poet Stephen Crane, and everything exploded for me. But it all comes back to that tape recorder.
Into the valley of death rode the 600.
Yeah.
Volleyed and thundered and lots of lovely. It used to be a staple in school elocution for the entire class to do, because you have a bunch of, you know, pimply boys trying to make their voices all go, you know, on the
Yeah.
volleyed and thundered. Yes. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, you mentioned, of course, I would think that Tennyson probably didn't register on your memory at that point. But what were the names that come to mind when you say, whenever I were to ask you, who were your the earliest poets that you remembered?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the children's author, Dr. Seuss, I didn't think of those as poems. They were rhyming storybooks. The Cat in the Hat and The Grinch Who Stole Christmas and those books. But in terms of actual poetry, yeah, the name Tennyson didn't stick in my mind. I only realized later that's what I'd heard. But E.E. Cummings, I think, inspires a lot of young poets because E.E. Cummings wrote with, small letters and big letters and punctuation all over the page, and he spelled words any way he wanted. And it was like this incredible freedom. So I found E.E. Cummings very, very inspiring. There was an American poet named Stephen Crane who lived from about 1870 to about 1900. And he wrote these very short allegorical poems, I would say. They were very, very bleak. And they were almost so bleak and so dark that it was funny. And I imagined that he actually thought, this is so dark and bleak. It's hilarious that I'm inflicting this on my audience. Maybe not, but that's sort of how I imagined Stephen Crane looking at his poems. In Canada, there was a poet whose work I discovered when I was about 14, a guy named David W. McFadden. And he wrote poetry about really heavy, serious things, but his poems were very funny. And they were written as very conversational voice. It was like you were sitting having a coffee with this guy, and he was just telling you these stories. And they were very funny, but they were about death and jealousy and loss. And I discovered you can write poetry that just sounds like people talking. And you can also write about heavy things and be funny. And that was a great revelation for me. I met David McFadden about 5 or 6 years later at a poetry reading in Toronto. And then many years later, I became the editor of his last 6 books. He died a couple of years ago. And it was such a great privilege. This guy who had changed my whole view of poetry. And I got the opportunity to tell him that many times, became a friend. And then I was able to work with him on his last 6 books. So that was very exciting. I was also very inspired. We talked a little earlier, I think, before we started here about sound poetry. And there were some sound poets in Toronto, Bill Bissett, a group called the Four Horsemen, another guy named Joe Rosenblatt. And they did this, maybe it was the logical extension of things like, Volleyed and Thundered and Tennyson, these sort of chanting poems, these poems based in sound, sometimes without even words. And I was so excited by that. This idea that you could take words and stretch them out like dough, and you could twist them around and put them through distorting mirrors. And any sound that you make could have an emotion or a tone, even if you weren't actually saying a word. And that was a great revelation for me. And a bit later, I started discovering a lot of great American poets that were contemporary, John Ashbery, Ron Padgett, Lisa Jarneau. And I'm still discovering so many writers. And what's exciting now is just all of the translation has exploded in the last few decades. And we're just reading poems from all over the world. It's so, so exciting to see what's out there. And it's an endless journey.
When did you first start writing? You write not just poetry, of course, you do write fiction as well. And when did you first start writing? When did you first start? Was poetry something that you started with? Where did poetry figure in your evolution as a writer?
Yeah, I think that I wrote a little tiny, I called it a novel, a little science fiction novel when I was about 11 years old. Called The Many Escapes of Specimen 399939X or something like that, a ridiculous little science fiction novel. It was I hand wrote it in edition of 1, and I bound it with a little piece of string. So I was already publishing, my first work was already published in an edition of 1. But I think when I was 11 or 12, I started writing some terrible little rhyming poems, just terrible. And then I discovered E. Cummings and Stephen Crane. And so when I was really 12, 13, 14, I wrote all of the time. I wrote poems of protest and hippie kind of poems. And I started even doing readings. I was in middle school, or junior high as we call it here. And I would go to the elementary schools and do readings of my poetry. So even when I was 14, I was reading to 9 and 10-year-olds. And then when I was 17 or 18, I was reading to the 14 and 15-year-olds. And then I began doing public readings, you know, in my teens, really. So it's been a big part of me for, you know, as long as I can remember.
Would you, when would you say that you would first have felt that you could call yourself a poet?
Wow, that's a great question. I sometimes still have imposter syndrome, calling myself, even with 12 books of poetry published and countless chapbooks, I still have some imposter syndrome. I think that a lot of poets are continually questioning themselves, like, what am I doing? Is there any point to this? Am I a phony? I don't know, maybe it's just me who thinks that. But I was probably in my mid-30s. Up until then, people would ask me, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm an editor. Oh, I write some poetry as well. But maybe when I was about 35 or 36, and I think I had my first book of poetry published and very many chapbooks, that I would actually say, I'm a poet. And then but I make a living as an editor. You know, I would always qualify it in some way. And I even still feel like it's slightly pretentious to say, oh, I'm a poet. But I guess I am a poet. I mean, I am a poet. So I shouldn't, you know, maybe hopefully before, you know, before my last days, I'll be able to say it with greater confidence and authority.
Why is it, do you think that, and I've seen this often, as you said, imposter syndrome, it feels presumptuous, things like that, people say about it. I know I've had that myself. When people ask, I say, yes, I write poetry, but I have great difficulty saying I am a poet.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I write poetry. I could say that.
Why do you think that so many poets have this issue? I mean, a lot of people don't. I don't mean to, you know, place this burden on every aspiring poet or every poet who's published and things like that. I know that quite a few do. Why do you think that happens, since you share that?
Maybe there's something about, you know, I think serious poets are poets who've really read the poets who've come before and their contemporaries. And we find poets who are so exciting to us and who perhaps we worship in some way. And to say I am a poet, for me to say I am a poet is putting myself in a way in the same place as John Ashbery or, you know, or Ron Paget, these poets who are so mythical to me, or David McFadden. So maybe it feels a little presumptuous just to put myself in the same job description as someone like that, whose work has influenced me so much and inspired me so much.
Do you have the same kind of hesitance about calling yourself a writer or an author?
Interesting. That's really interesting, Peter. No, I don't. I will readily tell people that I'm a writer, and that I write fiction, and that I write novels. That comes a lot easier to me. And I do say that I'm a poet now. I still have a little bit of difficulty with it, but yeah, I can say I'm a writer easily enough, because I could be writing driver's licensing manuals too, I guess, or you know, or anything else. That's a really great question.
I mean, yes, with 20 books behind you, you know, there shouldn't be any hesitancy at all about calling yourself a writer. And I think, how much of your influences have come from close by around you? You know, we're the same age, give or take, you know, and I grew up in India, reading a lot of poetry that came from the UK and America in English poetry, and only later encountered contemporary poetry or even older poetry by writers in English. And that is my limitation is that I'm fluent in only one language, despite living in such a multilingual country. And I don't write in any other language, though I can follow a little bit of Hindi and stuff like that. For you growing up, where did your influences come from? The neighborhood? I mean, when I say the neighborhood, I mean like your country, or were they wide?
When I first started out, as I said, the first couple of poets I was aware of, aside from Tennyson, were Americans, Stephen Crane and E.E. Cummings, a few others. And then into my teenage years, I started going out to poetry readings, and maybe our textbooks had more Canadian poets in it. So I started learning more about Canadian poets. But even by my late teens, I was reading, I found Vladimir Mayakovsky, the Russian poet, and Gottfried Benn, a German poet. And I was starting to get very, very excited by poets from other countries, from Europe, especially Eastern Europe. I think because I was very, very attracted to surrealism and absurdity, and that was where a lot of that writing seemed to be coming from. Central Europe and Eastern Europe is rife with surreal work, experimental work, and that kind of avant-garde that really, really attracted me.
When it comes to poetry, what were your, if you could sort of go through your evolution in terms of what would you call yourself as? Like, would you let us say that you're okay with calling yourself a poet, but what kind of poet would you say? What kind of poetry have you experimented with over the years?
Yeah, I would say that primarily I would say I'm a surrealist or a post-surrealist. There's the purists who believe the surrealists were only, in France in 1919 or something, but I would say that I'm a surrealist or a post-surrealist writer. Some of the work I do is experimental. Some of the work I would call absurdist. I would very, very influenced by absurdist theater, Samuel Beckett, Pinter, and so forth. That's been a big influence, though I'm not a playwright. It's been a big influence on both my fiction and my poetry as well. So I would probably say I'm an imagist, a surrealist, an absurdist would be the three categories. But I also write minimalist nature poems and all sorts of poems, and lyric poems occasionally.
When it comes to poetry on the page and poetry on the stage, so to speak, and I use the word stage broadly, performing your poetry or thing, where do you find yourself most comfortable?
I really hate writing. I hate the act of writing. I find it usually about 90% of the time, I find it excruciating to write, but I'm so thrilled having written once I've completed something, and then I like working on it afterwards. But that initial writing, I don't like at all. I really love giving readings, and I really love to read poems aloud at readings that I've never read aloud before. I don't practice. I just sort of time things by going 1 minute per page, because I don't like to practice. I want to sort of explore the poem as I'm reading it for the first time, and almost like I'm feeling like I'm the audience reading my own poems. So I do like to read because I also love the energy of the audience, and even seeing here some comments down the chat. That's really nice, and knowing there's people here. But I really believe that the page is the place for poetry. And I think that aside from sound poetry or other kind of performative poetry, which is part theater and part music, I believe that the poem has to be able to exist on the page. And even just the field of the page, the white space around the poem, the sonnet looks like a little square in the middle of a page, or, the poem the sort of a little imagist poem that dribbles down the left margin. All those things are very exciting to me. And I love the physical book, the page, the poem breathing on a page.
And where do you stand on form, on poetic form? You mentioned the sonnet just now. You also spoke earlier of Cummings being someone who excited you as a young person because of the rejection of so much that had gone before, of being wild, chaotic, etc. Where do you find yourself now when it comes to form? What do you think about form?
I think form is an interesting thing. And I have, I've written the occasional pantoum. I've written sort of contemporary version of the sonnet. I've even written some rhyming poems, very few rhyming poems, really. I think when formal poems are done really, really well, it's a very exciting thing. What interests me more is free verse, and also ways of ripping apart forms and adapting forms in different ways, or even meshing together forms. But I think it's an important thing, certainly, to learn starting out. But then I still, I go back to the poems of John Donne, the poems of Emily Dickinson, and so forth, and I take great pleasure in them. But as a writer, I sit down, and sometimes free verse appears on the screen or on the page before me. And if it's going to be form, it's usually that I sit down and it's that I'm presenting myself with a challenge. So there's poems where I sit down and I'm going to write a sonnet made up entirely of the names of songs and the names of movies. And I'm going to make a rhyme scheme. And so that kind of challenge is really exciting to me. But usually it's free verse that starts bubbling up on the page for me.
And on performance, what do you think about spoken word performance? People who, I mean, you said the poem is on the page for you. Okay, it's best seen on the page. But what do you think about performance? Do you enjoy performance poetry?
Well, you mentioned spoken word poetry. And then there's like sound. I really love a lot of sound poetry. Sound poetry is very exciting to me, as whether solo or with ensembles and so forth. I've gotten myself into a lot of trouble about, I've been a little outspoken about spoken word poetry. And I used to conflate it with slam poetry, which is the competitive side of spoken word. And that was a mistake. A young poet in Toronto pointed out to me that I was making slam and spoken word interchangeable. And I don't like slam poetry. I don't like poetry as competition. I don't like that aspect of slam and of spoken word where it's, I did this, I did that, I can do this, I'll do that. Or everyone's trying to outdo each other with aggression. I mean, especially among male poets. Women spoken word artists tend to be much more interesting, I find, or men are sort of more testosterone driven. And I don't think the writing is very good. I think that the wordplay is at a very simplistic level so much of the time. But then, I started looking more into more spoken word poetry that wasn't in slams. And I found there's some very, very interesting poets. And I also realized that so much published poetry on the page is really awful. And just as so much spoken word poetry is really awful. And then there's some pretty good stuff. And then there's some great stuff. But I don't go to spoken word readings.
Yeah, but that's true of any poetry that, or I mean, any kind of writing, anything really. There is that 10% of stuff that is probably going to last. There's 10% that is putrid and could not have seen the light of day. And everything else is somewhere in between, right?
Yeah.
But yeah. All right, let me just go in. We have a few questions from the audience.
Okay.
And one that segues kind of, from what we were talking about just now about poetry to an audience live. This is from Gala, who asks, could you tell us more about the street readings you used to do? Why did you feel it was important for you as a poet?
Street readings. That's so interesting. I didn't do a lot of street readings. Primarily, I used to self-publish pamphlets of my poetry and short stories. And I would stand out on the main street in Toronto downtown with a sign around my neck saying, "Shabby, no-name poet, buy my books," or poet going to hell, buy my books, or anything to get people's attention. And I sold my books for $2 or $3. I did that for about 10 years. So that was my primary presence in the street. But occasionally, especially with sound poetry, with one of my sound poetry partners in the early days, I remember we went into a huge shopping mall in Toronto called the Eaton Centre that has these really, really long escalators. And we actually took a music stand with us. And we went up and down the escalators with a music stand reading us or improvising on sound poetry scores. When I was selling books on the street, occasionally I would recite some of my poems. Certainly if anyone came up and asked me, I'd read them a poem. But sometimes just to get people's attention, I might read a poem. But I didn't really do full readings out there. But I do like this idea of bringing poetry to people who aren't expecting poetry. So standing out in the street selling chapbooks of poetry was like that. Barking poems at them as they walk by was part of that as well. And some people would stop and say, I've never, I haven't read a poetry book since I was in school, but I bought your poetry and it was weird. It was funny. I liked it. And so it was really nice to introduce people to poetry who might not otherwise be attracted to it or think that they might like it.
Ayesha Chatterjee asks, how much of you is Rozowski? Is he an alter ego, a dream self, or is there no connection?
Interesting. Alter ego or dream self. Those are both really interesting, and I wonder what the distinction is. Rozowski is definitely an alter ego. I saw Rozowski originally as my grandfather, Max Rozowski, who came over from Russia. He was the original Rozowski. And then I realized that Rozowski was all of these great grandfathers and relatives before him who, from the early 1800s or whenever. And then I realized Rozowski was also my father. And then I realized that I too am Rozowski. And it was sort of this gradual realization that Rozowski started becoming really all of the male members of me, my father, my grandfather, and so forth, and the uncles and those old pictures of these guys in Russia with these huge beards. And I don't even know any of their names, but to me, they're all Rozowskis. And more recently, I've been writing about the women, about my grandmothers. And I find it's hard to call them Rozowski. So I'm calling them by their unmarried names at the moment. And they're starting to really enrich the poems, looking at my mother's mother and my father's mother and entering them into those poems. And I feel like the idea of Rozowski, sort of an alter ego, a dream self at times as well, but I feel like creating this Rozowski makes all of the generations exist at the same time. Because in a way, we're the sum of everyone who's come before us. So in a sense that we all exist on the same plane in some way. And I think that that's what Rozowski is now encompassing and bringing in everybody all at once from a couple of centuries.
As Aisha says, there's a poem right there, I too am Rozowski. Interesting as you note about the women. In a patronymial kind of system, the women stories, and in a patriarchal world, the stories of the women who came before us are often lost, as the identity goes by the names that we know each other by, and names being passed down in practically every culture of the world, barring a very few, from father to son, and that kind of thing. And of course, names do change, as happened with your family, who decided at one point along the line, Rozowski became a Ross, to integrate, to fit in, to be.
That's right, exactly.
To be not foreign. How many generations of Rosses are there as opposed to Rozowskis?
Only 2 generations of Rosses. Yeah.
So do you feel any connect to Russia
I'm sorry?
with your ancestry being, at least in this line, coming in from the Volga, so to speak? Where do you feel any of that influencing you as a creative person? Your ancestry coming in?
Yeah, well, my paternal ancestors are from Russia and my maternal ancestors are from Poland. And in fact, my other grandfather, Blatt, his name was Blatt, which interesting enough is that the German word for like a leaf, like a page. And Blatt appears in some of the poems as well. More and more Blatt is coming into the poems. So there's Rozowski and Blatt, and then the women are coming in under their names, Mandelbaum and so forth. I think that having now read a fair amount of Central European and Eastern European writing, I can see that there's a bit of a gray cloud with some kind of humor burbling underneath it. And I think that that's it's a very common thing in a lot of the European writing and the writing from Poland and Russia that I've read. I think the influence is probably mostly unconscious, but I'm also aware of this ancestry that goes back to this really mystical place that I only mostly saw in black and white photographs of my ancestors, the strange garb they were wearing. And I don't know if a lot of that was because I don't know if they were Orthodox Jews back then in Russia. I'm not quite certain, but there was just such a mystique for me about those people. And I think that they probably have really, really influenced my writing, myself as a creative person, in ways that I don't know. No one's ever asked me that question before. So I'm going to give that a lot more thought. Thank you, Peter.
As you were saying that, the generations exist within us, the influences exist, they're all there at the same time, and we are our own people, of course, and we are interacting with the world. It's a very different world, and especially, which kind of segues to what Srinidhi was asking, has this extraordinary time that we are living in right now, where large parts of the world, most of the world, was in some form of lockdown, in some form of trying to protect themselves from this pandemic. Canada, as with India, suffered a lot. We've all lost friends, we've all lost loved ones. Many of us have been ill. How has this COVID, and I hope soon post-COVID world,
Yeah.
how has it changed? Has it in any way influenced your ideas, your style, your writing? Is there any writing that has come out of it?
It hasn't influenced my style in any way. I mean, I think I write in a variety of styles. I don't think it's influenced that in any way. It's crept up a little bit in my poetry, in some imagery, and it's usually not speaking. It's just people happen to wear masks, or I removed my mask, but there's nothing else about COVID in a poem except this one line that sort of just seems to come naturally or intuitively to me. I don't set out to write poems about those things. I've been writing a lot of very short stories, 2-page short stories. I'm working on a book of 100 2-page stories. And a lot of those stories are really influenced by themes of the climate crisis. And now, because it's possible that the origins of COVID are somehow connected to climate change, some of that is creeping into the short stories, but I haven't sat down and consciously written a poem about COVID or living in the COVID era. There's certain things that I think that I block off. Like, I think a computer only appears in one poem of mine and none of my fiction. I just don't want computers in my writing. And I think I don't want COVID in my writing, at least in an overt way. I think I hadn't really thought about it, but that's, I think, just the thing I'm blocking out and trying to go on with my poetry as if there was no COVID, but it's seeping in tiny, tiny ways.
It's strange that you, I was thinking about just this, but what dates one? You know, the mention of a mobile phone says that a poem is post-90s. You know, a computer in a home kind of setting is post-80s kind of thing, and how all these things, little things that get into our writing. And I wish we could have the time to explore that little thing about why your computers don't want to be in your project, because that strikes me as being an interesting thought to follow. But we are coming close to the end of our time together. Let me ask one last question, which comes from Laurie, who asks, what are you currently working on in your poetry writing life? What interests you right now?
I'm always interested by so many things, and so much of my inspiration comes from just reading really, really broadly, discovering new poets all the time. I'm working on a few collections of poetry, or a few books of poetry. One is a collaborative poem with a friend of mine who lives in Nova Scotia, a very fine writer named Jamie Forsyth. She and I have been working on a book-length poem for about 8 years now. It's only about 40 pages so far, but we think we're coming to the end of it. I'm working on a collection that will be called 1000 Tiny Poems, and it will consist of 100 10-part poems. And in those 10-part poems, the first part only has 1 word, and the 10th part has 10 words, and the 5th part has 5 words. So I've got about 30 or 40 of those now. And it's a real challenge to, and I guess that's form. That's working in a form, really. And it's really a challenge to make a 2-word poem that's very different from all the other 2-word poems in the collection. And then I'm just gradually putting together the various miscellaneous poems that will presumably end up, if anyone wants to publish it, in a book sometime in the next few years. And if no one else wants to publish it, I'm sure I'll do it myself. And there's probably another couple of poetry projects. There's people I really want to collaborate with. So there's projects that I'm dreaming of as well.
So what would we call this form that you're inventing? Shall we call it the Rozowski, or should we call it the Ross? I'm going to say thank you to everyone who's attended. We will have one more poem at the end of this, and I hope it's a poem that I really connected with in the when Stuart sent me his poems later. But for now, let me thank everyone, everybody in the audience who made time to come and join us, give us a part of your Saturday, and for being part of Poetry with Prakriti. I will, while Stuart is reading his last poem, also paste in how you can follow Prakriti in the future. Thank you, of course, to Dr. Beena and her college for supporting this festival. We do hope we can join you in person one of these days, one of these years. And but thank you for the support that you have provided to the Prakriti Foundation and Poetry with Prakriti. Thank you, of course, also to the Prakriti Foundation for putting this together, for having this lovely festival. And now we have 2 more things to do. We'll take a group shot at the very end when we say bye. But before that, we will end, as should all lovely poetry evenings end, with another poem.
Okay. I'm having a poetry morning. I know you're having a poetry evening.
Sorry, I was being a hemispherist there.
Again, thank you so much. I was so intimidated to be asked questions by Peter, because his questions are so erudite, and I think he toned it down a little for me because I was intimidated. So thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and thank you to everybody involved with the Prakriti Foundation and Poetry with Prakriti. It's been a great experience. So this is a poem. Every year on January the 1st, I write a poem. I've been doing it for about 20 or 25 years, and I try not to plan, or I don't plan in advance at all what I'm going to do on New Year's Day. So whatever that New Year's Day means to me flows into the poem, and this is the poem I wrote for January the 1st, 2018. It's called Various Records. Open one eye and then the other, but when you open the second one, close the first one. This way You give each eye its day in the sun. The sun glints off the desert of snow that covers your driveway. The streets are empty. Your favorite record is playing in the sky. Wisps of cloud occasionally muffle the sound. This is the first day. One of your eyes, maybe your left, goes out to shovel the snow, while the other, likely your right, stays in and makes breakfast. Butter smeared on a dark rye plus genmai tea with pieces of walnut floating on top. Right now, the catastrophe seems very far away. Your phone rings. Someone wants to talk with you about a particular page in a book you either wrote or read. The connection is bad. But all words are good. It doesn't matter what anyone says, so long as they say it and you hear something. Let one ear listen and then the other. It is true that there are people you once knew who are no longer alive. It doesn't mean you can't hug them or tell them about a painting you saw or laugh at their jokes. One of the jokes hinges on bird's eye view versus bird's eye view. And by now, your impeccable driveway is flanked by huge berms of snow, and you are using a spoon to get at the last few walnut pieces from the bottom of your mug. You are only one person. The earth is covered in individuals. Various records play in the sky. Thanks again.
I'm going to ask Meera, Harish, Dr. Beena, Ranveer, if you could turn on video for a second so I could take a screenshot. Harish and Ranveer, are you okay with this, or should we go ahead without you? Okay. Hey, Ranveer. Harish? All right. Best smiles, please. And 1, 2. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you back next week. Next week, there isn't another reading. There is a book launch, which Meera will be letting people know about. Just 1 second for those of you who wanted this. Let me paste this in here. We'll just keep that on for a second. There's going to be a book launch event. We'll be back in a fortnight with another poet. And of course, through the rest of the year as well, with more poetry with Prakriti. Thank you, Stuart Ross. It was a pleasure.